In the year 1339, a weary traveler stepped onto the shores of a kingdom that seemed to exist between history and legend. He was not an ordinary traveler. By that point, he had crossed deserts that stretched beyond the horizon, survived violent storms at sea, walked through the courts of mighty sultans, spoken with emperors, merchants, warriors, and scholars. He had witnessed wonders that most people of his age could only imagine. Yet what he discovered on the farthest edges of the known world left a deeper impression than almost anything he had seen before. A young woman stood at the center of power. She commanded armies. She ruled a prosperous kingdom. She refused every prince who sought her hand in marriage. And according to the stories told about her, she would only marry a man capable of defeating her in single combat. Her name was Urduja. For nearly 7 centuries, historians, archaeologists, and storytellers have asked the same question. Was she real, or was she simply a legend born from the imagination of travelers and preserved by generations who refused to let her disappear? To answer that question, we must travel back to a world that existed long before European empires redrew the maps of Asia. A world most history books barely mention. A world of ships, kingdoms, warriors, and forgotten queens. The 14th century was a golden age for Southeast Asia. Long before European explorers appeared in Asian waters, the seas between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific formed one of the busiest trade networks on Earth. The ocean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Across these waters sailed Chinese junks loaded with silk and porcelain. Arab dhows carried spices, precious stones, and religious ideas from distant lands. Indian merchants transported textiles and knowledge across thousands of miles. Every monsoon season brought new ships, new languages, new opportunities, and new dangers. Trade connected entire civilizations. And along these maritime routes rose powerful kingdoms whose names are rarely remembered today. Srivijaya, Majapahit, Champa, Sukhothai, Lankasuka. These were not primitive societies isolated from the rest of the world. They were sophisticated powers with organized governments, thriving economies, advanced navigation, and complex cultures. Their rulers controlled strategic ports. Their merchants accumulated enormous wealth. Their ships crossed oceans. Their influence stretched across continents. The rulers of these kingdoms understood something that many European powers would only fully grasp centuries later. Whoever controlled the sea controlled trade, and whoever controlled trade controlled power. Gold from Sumatra flowed through their ports. Spices from the Moluccas traveled through their markets. Pearls from the Sulu Sea enriched their merchants. Chinese silk, Indian textiles, Arabian horses, ceramics, ivory, incense, and precious metals all passed through their hands. The wealth moving through Southeast Asia was staggering. It attracted merchants from every corner of the known world. But trade was not the only thing traveling across these waters. Ideas traveled too. Indian merchants brought Hinduism and Buddhism. Arab traders introduced Islam. Chinese diplomats carried political influence and cultural traditions. Local societies absorbed these influences and transformed them into something uniquely their own. The result was a vibrant, multicultural world unlike anything else on Earth. And at the very center of this network stood an archipelago that would one day become known as the Philippines. But in the 14th century, there was no nation called the Philippines. There was no unified state, no colonial government, no foreign empire controlling the islands. Instead, hundreds of independent communities flourished across the archipelago. Each settlement was led by local rulers known as datus. Some controlled only a few villages. Others governed prosperous trading centers connected to international commerce. These communities were fiercely independent, yet they shared something important. They were people of the sea. For generations, they had mastered the art of navigation. They crossed open oceans without compasses, without modern maps, without advanced instruments. They relied on stars, ocean currents, wind patterns, cloud formations, and even the behavior of birds, skills passed down through countless generations. Their vessels were remarkable, large trading ships capable of carrying dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Fast warships designed for raids and defense. Ocean-going craft that regularly traveled between the Philippines, Borneo, China, Japan, and the coasts of India. Chinese records from the Song dynasty describe trade with regions believed to be located within the Philippine archipelago. They mention beeswax, tortoiseshell, pearls, forest products, and other valuable goods exchanged for silk, porcelain, and iron. This was not a forgotten corner of the world. It was an active participant in one of history's greatest commercial networks. When Spanish explorers eventually arrived centuries later, many were surprised by what they encountered. They did not find isolated tribes living outside history. They found organized societies, communities with laws, systems of trade, social hierarchies, written languages, and traditions that stretched back centuries. But perhaps the greatest surprise involved the role of women. In medieval Europe, women's political and economic rights were often severely limited. In many parts of Southeast Asia, however, women possessed freedoms that would have shocked European observers. Women could own property. Women could inherit wealth. Women could manage businesses. Women could initiate divorce. Women could become spiritual leaders. And sometimes, women could rule. Across the islands, respected priestesses known as Babaylan served as healers, advisors, and intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Their influence extended far beyond religion. They often played important social and political roles within their communities. Female merchants managed trading enterprises. Noble women participated in diplomacy. And in times of war, women sometimes fought alongside men. Spanish chroniclers would later record numerous examples of women defending settlements during attacks. Others described female leaders negotiating directly with conquistadors. For these societies, female authority was not unusual. It was part of everyday life. And it was within this cultural environment that the legend of Urduja would eventually emerge. But before we can understand her story, we must first understand the man who preserved it. His name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Battuta. Born in Tangier, Morocco, in 1304, he came from a family of Islamic scholars. At the age of 21, he set out on what was supposed to be a pilgrimage to Mecca. The journey should have taken little more than a year. Instead, it became one of the greatest adventures in human history. For nearly 3 decades, Ibn Battuta traveled across the known world. He crossed North Africa, visited Arabia, journeyed through Persia, explored East Africa, served in the court of the Sultan of Delhi, traveled through Central Asia, reached China, and sailed across vast stretches of the Indian Ocean. By the time he finally returned home, he had traveled more than 75,000 miles. No traveler of his era, not even Marco Polo, covered a greater distance. His experiences were eventually recorded in a remarkable travel account known as the Rila. Part memoir, part travel journal, part historical record. The Rila offers an extraordinary glimpse into the medieval world, yet it also presents a challenge. Ibn Battuta was an exceptional observer, but he was not always a perfectly reliable narrator. Sometimes he exaggerated. Sometimes he repeated stories told by others. Sometimes he described events that historians still debate today, which means that every remarkable claim in his writings must be examined carefully. And among all the wonders he recorded, few are as mysterious as what happened during a voyage through the waters of Southeast Asia, a voyage that would bring him face to face with a ruler unlike any he had ever encountered. A woman whose story would echo across centuries, a woman known as Princess Urduja. The year was approximately 1345. After years of wandering across continents, Ibn Battuta had reached China, one of the wealthiest and most advanced civilizations of his age. He had witnessed magnificent cities, bustling ports, and the immense power of the Yuan dynasty. Yet his journey was far from over. As he prepared to travel south through the waters connecting China with the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, nature intervened. The sea had always been unpredictable. Even the most experienced sailors feared the monsoon winds. A voyage planned with confidence could be transformed into a struggle for survival within hours. Storms appeared without warning. Currents shifted unexpectedly. Entire fleets vanished beneath the waves. Somewhere during this voyage, Ibn Battuta's ship was reportedly driven off course. Whether by violent weather, changing winds, or navigational error, historians cannot say with certainty. What matters is where that detour allegedly led him. To a kingdom called Tawalisi, and to a ruler unlike anyone he had encountered before. When Ibn Battuta first heard about her, She was already famous. Her reputation traveled ahead of her like a banner carried on the wind. Merchants spoke of her. Sailors admired her. Foreign visitors described her with fascination. She was young, unmarried, exceptionally wealthy, and she commanded her own military forces. For a medieval traveler coming from the Islamic world, this was remarkable. Not because women never held power elsewhere, but because rulers like her were rare enough to attract immediate attention. When Ibn Battuta arrived at her court, he found himself entering a world that operated according to different assumptions. This was not a kingdom where women ruled quietly from behind curtains. This was not a court where power belonged exclusively to men. According to his account, Princess Urduja stood openly at the center of authority. She issued commands. She directed policy. She led warriors, and everyone around her appeared to accept this as perfectly normal. That detail is important. Ibn Battuta does not describe the people of Tawalisi as shocked by her authority. He does not suggest her rule was controversial. Instead, he writes as if her position was simply part of the society he was observing. That single detail has fascinated historians for centuries because it aligns closely with what we know about many societies throughout maritime Southeast Asia. Unlike much of medieval Europe, several Southeast Asian cultures granted women substantial political and economic influence. Female rulers were not common everywhere, but they were far from impossible. In fact, while Urduja remains controversial, other powerful women from the region are unquestionably historical figures. One of the most famous examples was Queen Tribhuwana Wijayatungga of the Majapahit Empire. She ruled from 1328 to 1350, almost exactly during the period when Ibn Battuta was traveling through Asia. She was not merely a ceremonial monarch. She led military campaigns, expanded territory, directed imperial policy, and helped transform Majapahit into one of Southeast Asia's most powerful states. Her existence proves that powerful female rulers were entirely possible during this era. Urduja, therefore, does not emerge from a historical vacuum. She fits within a broader regional tradition, and that makes her story harder to dismiss outright. According to Ibn Battuta, Tawalisi was prosperous. Its ports were active. Its people were wealthy. Gold ornaments adorned members of the elite. Trade connected the kingdom to neighboring regions. Merchants arrived carrying valuable goods from distant lands. Everything about the description suggests a thriving maritime society. This makes sense. The 14th century was a period of extraordinary commercial activity across Southeast Asia. Ports functioned as gateways between civilizations. Every ship carried not only cargo but information. Ideas moved alongside merchandise. Religions traveled alongside spices. Diplomacy traveled alongside silk. A successful ruler needed more than military strength. They needed intelligence, adaptability, political skill, the ability to negotiate with foreigners while protecting local interests. And by all accounts, Urduja possessed these qualities. Ibn Battuta describes her as intelligent, confident, and commanding. But one detail stands above all others: her refusal to marry. According to the story, countless suitors had sought her hand. Princes from neighboring kingdoms, powerful nobles, wealthy merchants, foreign dignitaries, all had been rejected. Not because she despised marriage, not because she lacked opportunities, but because she had established an extraordinary condition. She would marry only the man capable of defeating her in combat. No one had succeeded. The story sounds almost mythical, the kind of tale that belongs in epic poetry. Yet it reflects a recurring theme found throughout many cultures: the warrior woman who refuses to surrender her independence, the ruler who demands equality rather than submission. Whether literally true or not, the story reveals how people remembered her, not as someone's daughter, not as someone's wife, but as a sovereign individual, a leader whose identity was defined by strength. And perhaps that explains why her legend survived. People rarely preserve stories that feel ordinary. Legends endure because they express values that matter deeply to a culture. And Urduja embodied something powerful: the idea that authority could belong to a woman. The idea that leadership was earned through capability rather than gender. The idea that courage transcended social expectations. As Ibn Battuta spent time within Tawalisi, he observed a society organized around honor, warfare, and maritime commerce. Warriors trained constantly. Military readiness was considered essential. This was hardly surprising. The seas brought wealth, but they also brought danger. Pirates operated throughout regional waters. Rival kingdoms competed for resources. Trade routes required protection. A ruler unable to defend their territory could quickly lose everything. For this reason, martial skill occupied a central place in many Southeast Asian societies. Men trained for war. Women often trained as well. Historical records from later centuries confirm that women throughout parts of the Philippines participated in combat when circumstances demanded it. Some defended settlements during raids. Others accompanied military expeditions. Still others became symbols of resistance during periods of foreign invasion. The image of a female warrior was therefore not foreign to the region. It already existed within cultural memory. When Ibn Battuta watched Urduja's forces training, he reportedly expressed admiration for their discipline. These were not ceremonial soldiers. They were professionals, prepared for conflict, prepared to defend their homeland, prepared to follow a woman into battle. And perhaps that was the detail that remained with him most strongly, because even after decades of travel, after witnessing countless wonders across Africa, the Middle East, India, and China, he still considered this kingdom worthy of special mention. Something about it stood apart. Something about Urduja stood apart. Yet the deeper historians investigate her story, the stranger it becomes. Because after Ibn Battuta leaves Tawalisi, the historical trail begins to fade. No inscriptions bearing her name have been discovered. No royal decrees survive. No palace ruins can be definitively linked to her reign. It is as though she appears suddenly within the historical record, and then vanishes, leaving behind only questions. Who exactly was she? Where was Tawalisi located? Why does such an extraordinary ruler leave so little evidence behind? And most importantly, did history forget her, or was history deliberately stripped away? Those questions would eventually lead modern scholars into one of Southeast Asia's greatest historical mysteries. A mystery stretching across centuries. A mystery involving lost kingdoms, vanished documents, and entire chapters of history that may have been erased forever. And the search for answers is only beginning. And that is where the mystery truly begins. Because if Princess Urduja was as powerful as Ibn Battuta described, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Where was her kingdom? For more than a century, historians, archaeologists, linguists, and researchers have searched for the answer. Some believe they have found it. Others completely disagree. And despite decades of investigation, the location of Tawalisi remains one of Southeast Asia's greatest unsolved historical puzzles. The most popular theory places Tawalisi in what is now Pangasinan, a coastal province in northern Philippines facing the Lingayen Gulf. At first glance, the theory seems convincing. Pangasinan occupied a strategic location along important maritime trade routes. For centuries, merchants traveled through its waters carrying goods from China, Borneo, and the wider Malay world. Its fertile plains supported agriculture. Its coastline encouraged commerce. Its communities grew wealthy from fishing, salt production, and international trade. In many ways, it resembles the prosperous coastal kingdom described by Ibn Battuta. But geography alone is not enough. Historians needed stronger evidence, and so they began examining local traditions. What they discovered was intriguing. For generations, stories circulated throughout Pangasinan about a powerful female leader. The details varied from village to village. The names sometimes changed. Certain events appeared differently depending on who told the story. But the central image remained remarkably consistent. A warrior woman, a respected ruler, a leader who commanded loyalty and inspired admiration. Could these stories represent distant memories of Urduja? No one can prove it, yet the possibility continues to attract researchers. Then there is the mystery of the name itself. Tawalisi. The word appears only in Ibn Battuta's writings. No surviving local inscription mentions it. No known map identifies it. No contemporary source confirms its existence. That creates a significant challenge. Remember, Ibn Battuta was writing in Arabic. He was attempting to record foreign names from languages he did not fully understand. When sounds pass from one language into another, they often change dramatically. A single misplaced vowel can transform an entire word. Consonants shift. Pronunciations evolve. Meanings become obscured. Historians call this process phonetic drift, and it complicates everything. What Ibn Battuta wrote as Tawalisi may not have sounded anything like that to the people who lived there. The original name could have been entirely different. Over the years, scholars have proposed countless possibilities. Some suggest connections to settlements in northern Luzon. Others point toward regions near present-day Manila. Still others argue that the kingdom may have existed somewhere entirely outside the Philippines, and that possibility opens an even larger debate. What if Tawalisi was not Filipino at all? What if historians have been searching in the wrong place for generations? Several researchers have proposed alternative locations. Some believe Tawalisi may have been located in Borneo. Others suggest Sumatra. A few have argued for parts of mainland Southeast Asia. Each theory has strengths, and each theory has weaknesses. Borneo, for example, possessed wealthy trading communities and strong maritime traditions. Powerful women appear in several local legends. Its location also fits portions of Ibn Battuta's travel route. Yet direct evidence remains frustratingly scarce. Sumatra presents a similar challenge. The island had extensive contact with Muslim traders. Female authority was accepted in several communities. Later centuries would see the rise of powerful sultanas who ruled significant territories. Again, the possibility exists. Again, proof remains elusive. The truth is both simple and frustrating. No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will, because unlike many European kingdoms, medieval Southeast Asian states often left behind fewer permanent monuments. Many structures were built from wood rather than stone. Palm leaf manuscripts decayed in humid climates. Bamboo records disappeared over time. Entire libraries could vanish within a few generations. History here was fragile. And when fragile history encounters war, conquest, and colonization, entire civilizations can disappear from the record. To understand how much has been lost, consider another example. In 1989, workers near Manila made an astonishing discovery. Buried in mud was a thin copper plate covered with ancient writing. Today it is known as the Laguna copperplate inscription. Dating back to the year 900 AD, it remains the oldest known written document ever discovered in the Philippines. Its existence shocked historians. Why? Because it proved something many people had long underestimated. Complex writing systems existed in the archipelago centuries before European arrival. Legal agreements existed. Administration existed. Diplomatic relationships existed. The people who lived there were participating in a sophisticated regional world. And the most remarkable part? The document survived almost by accident. It was never stored in a royal archive. It was never carefully preserved. It simply happened to survive. Which raises an unsettling question. How many other records were not so fortunate? How many documents vanished forever? How many names disappeared? How many rulers were forgotten? How many women like Urduja existed but left behind no surviving trace? The more historians examine Southeast Asia's past, the more they realize that enormous portions of its history have simply been lost. Not because those societies lacked history, but because history can be destroyed. Wood rots, paper burns, empires collapse, languages disappear, stories fade. And then came colonialism. When Spanish forces arrived in the Philippines during the 16th century, they encountered societies with their own beliefs, traditions, political systems, and historical memories. But preserving those memories was not their priority. Converting people was. Restructuring society was. Establishing colonial authority was. Anything perceived as competing with that mission often became a target. Indigenous religious practices were condemned. Traditional leaders lost influence. Local customs were suppressed. Entire cultural systems faced pressure to conform to colonial expectations. In such an environment, countless historical records vanished. Some were destroyed deliberately. Others disappeared through neglect. Many simply failed to survive the upheaval. For figures like Urduja, this creates a devastating problem. Imagine trying to reconstruct the life of a medieval ruler after centuries of lost documents, erased traditions, and interrupted cultural memory. Even if she was completely real, much of the evidence may no longer exist. The absence of evidence does not necessarily mean she never lived. It may simply mean history was shattered before it could be preserved. And that distinction matters because modern discussions about Urduja often focus on what cannot be proven. But perhaps we should also consider what cannot be disproven. We know powerful women existed throughout Southeast Asia. We know maritime kingdoms flourished across the region. We know Ibn Battuta described meeting a ruler named Urduja. We know many indigenous records have been lost. Those facts are not controversial. The mystery lies in how they connect. Was Urduja a historical ruler whose story became legendary? Was she a composite character based on several women? Was she partially real and partially myth? Or was she an invention created through misunderstanding and exaggeration? The answers remain hidden. Yet strangely, the uncertainty itself has become part of her legacy. Because the less we know about her, the more she symbolizes something larger. She becomes a representation of every forgotten queen, every erased ruler, every woman whose achievements vanished from official history. And as historians continue searching for clues, another question begins to emerge. Perhaps the most important question of all. Why are we so quick to doubt women like Urduja in the first place? Why does the possibility of a warrior princess seem unbelievable to some people, when history itself is filled with powerful women who changed the course of nations? The deeper we investigate that question, the more revealing the answers become. And those answers lead directly into one of the most overlooked truths about pre-colonial Southeast Asia, a truth that challenges everything many people think they know about women, power, and history. And that question forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Not just about Princess Urduja, not just about Southeast Asia, but about history itself. Because history is often presented as a collection of facts, dates, names, battles, kings, empires. Yet the reality is far more complicated. History is also a story about survival, about whose records endure, about whose voices are preserved, and about whose memories are erased. When people hear the story of Princess Urduja, many immediately ask for proof. Where are the inscriptions? Where are the official documents? Where are the archaeological discoveries? The questions are reasonable. Historians depend on evidence. But there is another question that deserves equal attention. Why do we demand overwhelming proof for women like Urduja, while accepting far weaker evidence for many male figures from the same era? The answer reveals a deeper problem. For centuries, historical narratives were largely written by men living within patriarchal societies. Those writers often viewed political power as something naturally belonging to men. As a result, powerful women were frequently ignored, minimized, or transformed into legends, rather than recognized as historical actors. When records survived, men were remembered as rulers, women were remembered as exceptions, and sometimes, women were not remembered at all. Yet throughout Southeast Asia, female authority was neither rare nor shocking. In fact, many societies in the region operated very differently from medieval Europe. Women owned land, controlled wealth, managed trade networks, inherited property, influenced diplomacy, and in some communities, lineage itself was traced through women. These were not symbolic roles. They were practical forms of power. Take the Babaylan of the Philippines. Long before European colonization, these spiritual leaders occupied positions of enormous influence. Most were women. Others were men who adopted traditionally feminine social roles. They acted as healers, advisors, ritual specialists, and community leaders. People sought their guidance during crises. Deities consulted them before major decisions. Their authority extended far beyond religion. To Spanish missionaries, this was deeply troubling. The colonial system depended on replacing indigenous authority with new institutions loyal to the empire. The Babaylan represented an alternative source of power. And because many of them were women, they challenged European assumptions about gender as well. Spanish accounts often described them with hostility. They were labeled sorcerers, pagans, witches, enemies of civilization. But beneath that language lies an important truth. The colonizers feared them because they were influential, because people listened to them, because they possessed authority that could not easily be controlled. And that pattern repeated itself throughout Southeast Asia. Again and again, we encounter women exercising power in ways that contradict modern stereotypes about the pre-colonial world. In Sumatra, the Minangkabau developed one of the largest matrilineal societies on earth. Property passed through women. Family identity followed the maternal line. Women served as custodians of land and inheritance. Men often occupied leadership positions, but women controlled the foundation upon which those positions rested. In Vietnam, historical memory celebrates the Trung sisters. In the year 40 AD, they launched a rebellion against Chinese rule. According to tradition, they assembled a massive army and liberated dozens of strongholds. For a brief moment, they succeeded. They became symbols of resistance and national pride. Even after their defeat, their story endured for nearly 2,000 years, not because it was convenient, but because it mattered. In Java, queens ruled powerful kingdoms. In Asia, women eventually governed entire sultanates. Across maritime Southeast Asia, examples of female leadership appear again and again. Viewed within this broader context, Urduja suddenly becomes far less extraordinary, not because she was unimportant, but because women like her already existed. The world described by Ibn Battuta was a world where female rulers were possible, where female warriors were imaginable, where female authority was accepted, and perhaps that is why his account feels believable despite its mysteries. It fits the cultural reality of the region. Yet while local traditions often preserve memories of powerful women, colonial narratives frequently push them to the margins. The Philippines offers a striking example. When Spanish rule expanded across the archipelago, colonial officials promoted a particular version of history. According to that version, civilization arrived with Christianity. Order arrived with colonization. Progress arrived with Europe. Everything that came before was portrayed as primitive, backward, incomplete. But the historical evidence tells a different story. Pre-colonial societies possessed legal systems, trade networks, writing traditions, religious philosophies, diplomatic relationships, military organizations, and sophisticated cultural identities. The problem was not a lack of history. The problem was whose history was being told. One of the most tragic losses involved indigenous writing systems. Before Spanish rule, many communities used scripts derived from older Asian traditions. These writing systems appeared across different regions of the archipelago. People recorded contracts, genealogies, poetry, songs, stories. Knowledge passed through both oral and written traditions. Then much of it disappeared. Some records decayed naturally. Others were abandoned. Many were intentionally destroyed. Colonial authorities often viewed indigenous texts as obstacles to conversion. Anything associated with older belief systems became suspect. Generations later, historians found themselves confronting an enormous silence. Entire chapters of the past had vanished. And within that silence, figures like Urduja became difficult to verify. Imagine trying to reconstruct the life of a medieval queen after centuries of lost manuscripts. Imagine searching for evidence in a landscape where archives were burned, traditions disrupted, and local histories dismissed. The challenge is enormous. Yet despite these obstacles, memory survived. Not always in books, not always in official records, but in stories, in family traditions, in local legends, in community identity. That is why Urduja never completely disappeared. Even when historians debated her existence, ordinary people continued remembering her. Her name appeared in schools, monuments, festivals, cultural organizations. She became something larger than a historical question. She became a symbol, a reminder that Filipino history did not begin with colonization, a reminder that indigenous societies possessed their own heroes, their own leaders, their own achievements. And perhaps that explains why discussions about Urduja remain so emotionally powerful today. Because they are not really about a single woman. They are about recognition, about recovering forgotten histories, about reclaiming stories that were pushed aside for centuries. Every generation asks different questions of the past. Earlier historians often asked, "Can we prove she existed?" Modern historians increasingly ask, "What does her story tell us about the people who remembered her?" That shift is important, because legends are not random. They survive because they express something meaningful, something valuable, something worth preserving. The legend of Urduja expresses a belief in female strength, in independence, in courage, in leadership. Whether she ruled exactly as Ibn Battuta described almost becomes secondary, because even if the details changed over time, the core idea remained intact. People wanted to remember a woman who could not be controlled, a woman who led rather than followed, a woman who stood at the center of power instead of the edges. And that desire to remember tells us something profound about the society that preserved her story. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the mystery lies ahead, because in recent years, historians, archaeologists, linguists, and indigenous scholars have begun re-examining stories like Urduja's with completely fresh eyes. Instead of dismissing oral traditions as unreliable, they are asking a new question. What if these stories contain historical truths hidden beneath layers of legend? What if fragments of memory can reveal things that official records never captured? And what if Princess Urduja is not merely a forgotten ruler, but part of a much larger effort to reclaim entire histories that colonialism tried to erase? That possibility is transforming the way we understand the past, and it brings us to the final chapter of our extraordinary story. Today, nearly 700 years after Ibn Battuta recorded her name, Princess Urduja exists in a fascinating space between history and legend. She is everywhere, and yet she is nowhere. In the Philippines, her legacy lives on through schools, monuments, cultural festivals, books, films, and local traditions. Children grow up hearing her name. Historians debate her existence. Artists reimagine her story. Writers transform her into a symbol of courage and independence. But despite all this attention, the question remains unanswered. Was she real? Some scholars argue that she was nothing more than a literary invention. They point to the weaknesses in Ibn Battuta's account. They remind us that medieval travel writers often mix fact with rumor. They note that no surviving inscription, royal decree, or local document has yet confirmed her existence. Their skepticism is understandable. History demands evidence, and evidence matters. But there are other scholars who see the situation differently. They argue that Urduja may represent a real historical figure whose story was gradually transformed by centuries of retelling. Others believe she could be a composite character, a memory of several powerful women combined into a single legendary ruler. And then there are those who believe that somewhere, hidden beneath layers of forgotten history, the truth still waits to be discovered. Perhaps an undiscovered manuscript, perhaps an untranslated genealogy, perhaps an archaeological discovery buried beneath centuries of soil, perhaps a story preserved in oral tradition that has not yet been recorded. The truth is that we simply do not know, and maybe that uncertainty is exactly what makes her story so powerful, because the deeper we look into the world that produced the legend of Urduja, the more we realize something important. A woman like her was entirely possible. The maritime kingdoms of Southeast Asia were places where women could inherit power, command respect, lead communities, influence trade, and sometimes rule. The world that produced Urduja was real. The cultures that made her possible were real. The women who inspired stories like hers were real. Whether Urduja herself existed exactly as Ibn Battuta described almost becomes a secondary question, because legends do not survive for centuries by accident. They survive because they carry meaning, and Urduja carries meaning. She reminds us that history is not fixed, that the past is not a completed story, that there are still voices waiting to be heard beneath the silence of lost records and forgotten archives. In recent years, historians across Southeast Asia have begun re-examining indigenous histories with fresh eyes. Oral traditions are being studied more seriously. Ancient texts are being translated. Archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of the region's past. Instead of asking only what colonial records say, researchers are beginning to ask what local communities remember. What stories survived? What memories endured? What truths may still be hidden within legend? This approach has transformed historical research. It recognizes that the absence of written evidence is not always evidence of absence. Sometimes it is evidence of destruction, evidence of conquest, evidence of histories that were interrupted before they could be preserved. And that is why Urduja matters. She represents more than a single woman. She represents every forgotten queen, every erased leader, every indigenous hero whose story was pushed aside by centuries of colonial rule. She reminds us that before foreign empires arrived, there were already kingdoms. Before colonial governments, there were already rulers. Before outsiders claimed to bring civilization, there were already thriving societies filled with knowledge, culture, and power. In the end, Princess Urduja stands at the edge of history, one foot planted in documented reality, the other in the realm of legend. We may never know exactly who she was. We may never know precisely where Tawalasi stood. We may never uncover the final piece of evidence that settles the debate forever. But perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps her greatest victory is that she survived, not in royal archives, not in imperial records, but in the memory of a people who refused to forget. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. Maps were redrawn. Yet her name endured. And as long as people continue searching, questioning, and remembering, Princess Urduja will remain what she has always been, a warrior, a ruler, a mystery, and a reminder that history still holds secrets waiting to be found.